Hey there. The stuff you sent over about synthesis and writing, that's really fascinating and, something we want to dive into today. So we're gonna really unpack what synthesis is, why it matters so much, and how it's different from just, summarizing stuff you've read. Think of this as a way to get better at like not just seeing information, but really getting how all the different pieces fit together and create something bigger. You've given us these great excerpts, a real in-depth guide, and hopefully by the time we're done here, you'll see how synthesis can help you understand things better and like think more critically when you're dealing with different sources. So, yeah, let's get into it, shall we? What is synthesis really all about at its core?
Well, when you get down to it, synthesis is all about taking information from at least two sources and kind of like weaving them together to come up with a fresh understanding or a new perspective. It's not just about repeating what each source says separately, right? It's more like you're actively searching for those connections between them, you know, where they agree, where they disagree, where they overlap, and then using those connections to create something new.
Okay, I'm digging that.
It's kind of like, when you're in the kitchen and you have all these different ingredients like flour, sugar, butter. Each one has its own purpose, but when you mix them together in a specific way, boom, you get something totally different, like a cookie.
Right.
Synthesis in writing works the same way. You're taking these informational ingredients and you're crafting a more complex, more nuanced understanding.
That cooking analogy, that really hits home. So it's definitely more than just saying source A says this and source B says that, which kind of brings us to a key point here. The difference between synthesis and summarizing. Because I can see how those could get mixed up. Can we really break down those distinctions?
Yeah, absolutely. While both of them, they both involve working with source material, their aims and how you approach them are pretty different. Summarizing, as the name kind of suggests, is about boiling down the main points of a single source, just one. And the goal there is to provide a short overview, hitting those main points that the original author made. You're basically answering the question, what were the main takeaways from this author?
I see.
For instance, the guide you gave us has this. Kavazat et al., 2012, described transactional leaders as agents of social and organizational change who possess four models of conduct that influence subordinate performance. So that's a really concise report of what those researchers found, describing these four main ways, these models of conduct that impact how well their subordinates do their jobs. There's no interpretation or connection to other ideas there, you see.
Right. So it's really tied to that one specific piece of work. So how does it go in a different direction?
Well, synthesis, on the other hand, is all about like creating this conversation between multiple sources. You're looking at what each author is saying, pinpointing where they agree, where they disagree, and then thinking about what those relationships mean, what the implications are. It's not just about relaying the information, but about creating new meaning, like meaning that comes from how those sources interact with each other. So the main question shifts from what did the author say to how do these sources, when you look at them together, lead to a new understanding?
I'm with you.
And the guide gives us a great example of this. It says, transactional leaders are often viewed as agents of change who influence subordinate performance through four models of conduct. Kavazat et al., 2012. However, Berger, in 2013, highlights that the effectiveness of these models depends on the leader's ability to articulate a clear vision. While Antonakis et al., in 2011, they emphasize the role of charisma in driving follower commitment. Taken together, these perspectives suggest that successful transactional leadership requires both structure and inspiration. So notice how that goes beyond just stating what each study found individually, right? It connects those findings and offers a more complete picture.
Yeah, I'm seeing how those pieces fit together now.
And think about it like this. You're researching a tricky problem at work. Just reading separate reports might give you parts of the answer, right? But it's true synthesis that allows you to see how all those parts connect, and that can reveal root causes or even innovative solutions that you wouldn't have seen otherwise.
It's like having those different pieces of evidence, and suddenly you see how they all contribute to a bigger, more detailed picture.
Exactly.
And the guide also has this handy table that really lays out those key differences. Things like how many sources are involved, the purpose reporting versus creating new meaning, the role of critical analysis, which isn't really there in summarizing, that is so important for synthesis, and then the outcome, Is it an overview or a new understanding?
Yeah, that's spot on. And that outcome, that's really the heart of it. Synthesis is all about creating something new, something that no single source explicitly says, but that comes from, like putting them all together. And the guide makes a good point about why this is so valued in academic writing. It shows that you're not just passively taking in facts, you're really thinking critically about them, making connections, and building your own informed view.
Okay, so we've got what synthesis is and how it's different from summary. Now, I think it's time for some real-world examples. The guide has what it calls a non-example of synthesis, which is about transactional leaders. Can we break down why why it doesn't quite make the cut?
Sure, sure. This non-example, it says, transactional leaders are seen as agents of social and organizational change, Cavazot et al., 2012. Transactional leaders should possess the four models of conduct to express a new and more precise vision in those they lead. Additionally, transactional leadership includes four dimensions that lead toward achieving organizational goals. These dimensions idealize how a manager can influence subordinate job performance, often referred to as charisma. And the biggest issue here is that there's no real integration. It mentions Cavazot et al., but then it just throws out these ideas without really tying them back to that source or bringing in any other viewpoints to build on or refine the original point. It reads more like a bunch of separate statements about transactional leadership instead of, a synthesis of different perspectives. There's no real analysis of how those different aspects of transactional leadership relate to each other or how different researchers might contribute to our understanding of them. It's almost like name dropping in your writing,
Yeah.
You want to show that you've read the big names, but the idea itself, it should stand on its own.
Yeah, it feels disjointed, like you're just listing characteristics of transactional leadership instead of actually synthesizing the different ideas about it.
Right.
Now, let's take a look at the example of synthesis that's in the guide. What makes that one so much more effective?
Well, this example takes those same basic ideas, but it actually weaves them together in a much better way. It says, transactional leaders are seen as agents of social and organizational change, Cavazot et al., 2012. Transactional leaders should possess the four models of conduct to express a new and more precise vision in those they lead, Berger, 2013. Additionally, transactional leadership includes four dimensions that lead toward achieving organizational goals, Cavazot, 2012. These dimensions show how a manager can influence subordinate job performance, Berger 2013, often referred to as charisma, Antonakis et al. 2011. So what makes this actual synthesis is how it clearly links the different sources to specific aspects of transactional leadership. It shows how Cavazot et al. Lay the groundwork, right? They identify transactional leaders as change agents and then describe their models of conduct and dimensions for achieving goals.
Right.
Then it brings in Berger, and Berger suggests that those models are used to articulate a vision. And finally, we've got Antonakis et al., who come in with the concept of charisma as a way of influencing performance. Now, the writing might not be the most beautiful, but it starts to build a more layered understanding by showing how different researchers contribute to different parts of what transactional leadership is all about.
I'm seeing the difference now. It's about showing how those connections work and how all the different research adds to this broader understanding. Now, the guide also mentions some common mistakes to avoid when you're trying to do synthesis. One that jumped out at me was pseudosynthesis, multiple works within a single citation. What exactly is that, and why is it a problem?
Ugh, that's a really important one to understand. Pseudosynthesis happens when you make a statement and then just slap on a whole bunch of citations without really explaining how those sources all connect to what you just said. The example they give is, successful leaders appreciate opportunity and take steps to identify and promote potential within all team members. Antonakis et al., 2011, Berger, 2014, Cavazot et al., 2012, Thompson et al., 2008. Now, it might be true that all these researchers talk about successful leadership in some way, but that citation doesn't show how each one specifically backs up the idea of appreciating opportunity and promoting potential. It's like taking a shortcut, right? It avoids the real work of synthesis, which is about explaining what's unique about each source and how it fits into the overall point you're making.
It's like you're just showing off that you did the reading instead of really showing that you synthesized the information from all that reading.
Exactly.
The guide also advises against using too many direct quotes in synthesis. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, because the main goal of synthesis is your interpretation and how you integrate those ideas, right? Direct quotes, they just present the original author's words. not your synthesized understanding of what they mean in relation to other sources. If you rely too much on quotes, it can make your writing feel like a patchwork of other people's thoughts rather than your own informed analysis. You want to show that you understand the concepts well enough to put them into your own words and connect them using your own voice. Now, a well-chosen quote can be great for emphasizing a point that's really well said, but most of your synthesis should be in your own words.
But isn't all writing, in a way, building on what came before it? Where do you draw the line between just referencing and actually making something new through synthesis?
You're right. That's a good question. The newness in synthesis, it comes from those specific connections and interpretations that you make between different sources. It's about the unique perspective that you bring to the table by bringing those sources together in a way that highlights a certain point or argument that no single source made on its own. It's the intellectual work of weaving those different threads together to create a whole new understanding.
Gotcha. So it's about creating something new from the existing pieces. Another thing the guide talks about is avoiding phrases like, according to, an author said. Why are those generally frowned upon in synthesis?
Because they can weaken your voice as an author. When you start everything with according to, it can make you sound like you're just reporting what others have said, instead of confidently putting forward your own synthesized understanding. The guide actually shows how to improve these statements, like taking something like, according to Antonakis et al. In 2011, effective leaders appreciate the opportunity to lead, and changing it to, effective leaders value the opportunity to lead, Antonakis et al., 2011. And then there's an even better example that really integrates multiple sources and ideas smoothly. The point is, those stronger versions, they present the information with more confidence, and the citations just become support for what you're saying instead of being the main focus.
Right, the goal is to really own that synthesis, not just to say who said what. Now let's move on to the writing style guidelines for synthesis. The guide stresses a formal academic tone, which, yeah, makes sense for this kind of writing. It also talks about avoiding passive voice and sticking to active voice. Can you explain why that's so important when you're writing a synthesis?
Sure. In academic writing, being clear and precise is super important, and using active voice really helps with that. Passive voice, where the subject is the one receiving the action, can often make your sentences wordy, confusing, and kind of impersonal. For example, the research was analyzed by the authors. That's passive is much weaker than the authors analyzed the research, which is active. In synthesis, you're actively making connections and drawing conclusions from different sources, so using active voice reflects that you're taking charge. It makes your writing more assertive and easier for the reader to follow. It clearly tells you who's doing what, which is especially important when you're talking about different researchers and how their ideas fit together.
Yeah.
And the guide gives us an example that really shows this. The connection between leadership style and employee performance was demonstrated by multiple studies. That's passive compared to. Multiple studies demonstrate a connection between leadership style and employee performance. That's active. That active version is so much clearer and more engaging.
Yeah, that clarity is so important when you're trying to get your point across. The guide also suggests using third-person narrative and present tense paraphrasing. Why are those good choices for writing a synthesis?
Well, third-person narrative, which means avoiding I, we, and you, it helps you keep that objective, scholarly tone that's usually expected in academic writing. The focus should be on the information itself and how the sources relate, not your personal opinions or experiences. And using the present tense, it's usually preferred when you're talking about, like, established knowledge, research findings, published works. It gives the idea that those findings are still relevant and true today. So when you say something like Berger, in 2013, highlights that leaders who promote team potential demonstrate higher levels of organizational success, that present tense highlights makes it clear that this is an ongoing, accepted finding from Berger's work. These choices in style make your synthesis more credible and authoritative.
It makes sense. It's all about keeping the focus on the information and not on any personal opinions. We've talked about avoiding direct quotes, but the guide brings it up again and really emphasizes paraphrasing. Why is paraphrasing so crucial for good synthesis?
It's because paraphrasing is at the heart of effective synthesis. When you paraphrase, you're taking those key ideas from a source and putting them into your own words. It shows that you get the material well enough to explain it in a different way, and it lets you blend those ideas from different sources more smoothly into your writing. It's about showing that you understand and can connect the dots, not just borrowing someone else's words. The example in the guide really shows the difference between a direct quote and a paraphrase, and how paraphrasing helps you integrate that idea more naturally into your own writing.
And lastly, the guide talks about minimizing bias, opinion, and embellishment. Why is staying neutral so important in synthesis?
Well, being objective is a fundamental rule in academic writing, and synthesis is no different. Your job is to analyze and combine information from different sources in a fair and unbiased way, not to push a specific viewpoint or let your own biases affect how you interpret things. Using opinions, subjective language, unsupported claims, this can really damage your credibility. Same with embellishing things or being overly dramatic. It takes away from that analytical tone and can make your work seem less rigorous. You want your synthesis to be based on evidence and logical connections presented in a neutral, objective way.
These writing guidelines are really helpful. They provide a practical way to create strong syntheses. And to wrap it all up, the guide has a few final things to keep in mind for effective synthesis. Comparing and contrasting sources, integrating those ideas carefully, and maintaining a logical flow. Can you quickly explain why those are so important for a successful synthesis?
Of course. Comparing and contrasting sources is essential for figuring out how they relate to each other, where they agree, where they disagree, and what parts of the picture might be missing. Thoughtful integration, that's the core of synthesis. It's about showing how different pieces of information connect to support or challenge your main point. And keeping a logical flow is super important for clarity. You got to guide the reader through your synthesis with clear transitions so they can understand how you're weaving those different pieces together to create a new, cohesive understanding.
This has been a really enlightening conversation. It's clear that synthesis is much more than just putting summaries together. It requires a higher level of thinking and a conscious, deliberate way of integrating information from all these different sources. So for you listening, think about the last time you came across information from different places on a specific topic. How might using these principles of synthesis have changed how you understood it or the conclusions you made? It's a truly powerful skill to develop, one that will absolutely help you navigate and make sense of the tons of information we face every day. We encourage you to take these ideas and really apply them to your own work and learning. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.